I knew the HOA was bad, but I never expected them to resort to arson. It started with a letter. A bright red envelope shoved into my mailbox, stamped with the official seal of the Oak Ridge Homeowners Association. I already knew who it was from before I even opened it. Linda Davenport, the HOA president and self-proclaimed ruler of our neighborhood. I tore it open and scanned the contents. Your property has been found in violation of the HOA aesthetic guidelines due to the deteriorating condition of the garden shed located in your backyard. You are required to remove or replace the structure within 10 days to maintain neighborhood standards. I rolled my eyes. My shed wasn't some rotting eyesore. Sure, the paint was a little faded and the vines creeping up the side gave it a rustic look, but I liked it that way. It was sturdy, functional, and most importantly on my land. I wasn't about to let some overzealous group of suburban dictators tell me what I could and couldn't have on my own property. So I ignored the letter. That was my first mistake. The second letter came 5 days later. This one was more aggressive. Failure to comply will result in mandatory removal at your expense. I was still debating whether to fight them or just repaint the shed to shut them up when I woke up one night to the smell of smoke. I shot out of bed, heart pounding, and ran to the back door. My shed, my perfectly fine, not hurting anyone's shed, was engulfed in flames. Orange light flickered against the night sky, and thick black smoke curled into the air. I grabbed my phone and called the fire department while sprinting to the garden hose. But by the time the fire trucks arrived, there wasn't much left. The fire had reduced my shed to a pile of charred wood and melted metal. The next morning, I found a notice taped to my front door. The Oak Ridge HOA has resolved your ongoing violation. You will receive an invoice for the removal costs. I stood there, gripping the paper so tightly my knuckles turned white. They burned it down. Linda Davenport and her little HOA minions actually burned down my shed because they didn't like how it looked. That was the moment I decided I wasn't just going to fight back. I was going to own them. The ashes of my shed were still smoldering when I made my decision. This wasn't just about a burned-down shed anymore. It was about power, control, and a corrupt HOA that thought they could bulldoze anyone who didn't bow to them. I spent the morning documenting everything. I took high-resolution photos of the charred remains, the scorched earth, and the smoke-stained fence. I collected the fire department's report, which stated the blaze was likely caused by arson. Then, I reached out to my neighbor, Mark, who had security cameras installed around his property. Mark was more than happy to help, considering he had his own long history of HOA disputes. When we reviewed the footage, my suspicions were confirmed. Around midnight, 2 figures snuck into my backyard. One of them carried a canister, likely gasoline, while the other struck a match. The flames erupted instantly, illuminating their faces just long enough for the camera to capture them. I leaned in closer, my jaw tightening. One of them was Linda Davenport's husband, a smug real estate broker who always backed his wife's heavy-handed HOA decisions. Perfect. With the evidence in hand, I considered my options. I could go to the police, but that would take time, and I wanted something more permanent than a fine or a slap on the wrist. I wanted to take the entire HOA down from the inside. That's when I had the idea. I spent the next few days researching the Oak Ridge HOA's financials. As a homeowner, I had access to certain records, but I needed more. I reached out to a friend of mine, Lisa, a real estate attorney who specialized in HOA law. After a few hours of digging, she sent me something that made my heart race with excitement. The land the HOA office and community center sat on wasn't actually owned by the HOA. It was leased from a private entity, a holding company that had gone bankrupt 6 months ago. The property was now sitting in limbo, waiting for bids from interested buyers. That's when the real plan formed. I pooled my resources, contacted a few investors I knew, and within 2 weeks I made an offer on the land. A generous one. The bank, eager to offload a non-performing asset, accepted without hesitation. Just like that, I became the new landlord of the Oak Ridge HOA's headquarters. The moment the sale was finalized, I had my attorney draft a formal notice of lease termination. The HOA had 30 days to vacate the premises. Then I waited. It didn't take long for Linda to come storming up my driveway, the notice crumpled in her manicured fist. "You can't do this." Her voice was shrill with rage. "This is our property." "It was," I corrected, leaning casually against my truck. "Now it's mine." Her face twisted in disbelief. "This is illegal. You can't just evict an HOA." I handed her a copy of the deed. "I can, and I did." She opened her mouth, then closed it, scanning the document with wide eyes. "But the HOA's funds are irrelevant," I cut in. "You've been leasing this property for years. You don't own it, and since I do now, I've decided I don't want you here anymore." For the first time since I had known her, Linda was speechless. I let the silence stretch before delivering the final blow. "By the way, I have security footage of your husband committing arson. I'm guessing the police would be very interested in that." Her complexion went from red to ghostly pale in an instant. "You wouldn't," she whispered. I folded my arms. "Try me." She clenched her fists, her whole body shaking. "What do you want?" I smiled. "Dissolve the HOA permanently. You step down, the board disbands, and every ridiculous, overreaching bylaw gets erased. If you do that, I don't press charges." Her eyes darted to the deed in her hands, then back to me. She knew she had no leverage. If the HOA lost its headquarters, they would have nowhere to conduct meetings, store records, or enforce their petty rules. And if her husband went to jail, her reputation and influence would be ruined. After a long, tense pause, she exhaled sharply. "Fine, you win." I extended a hand. "Put it in writing and we have a deal." She hesitated, then begrudgingly shook my hand. 2 weeks later, the Oak Ridge HOA was officially dissolved. The ridiculous fines, the arbitrary rules, the power-hungry board all gone, and as for Linda and her husband, they quietly sold their house and moved out of the neighborhood, unable to face the humiliation of their downfall. Justice served, the neighborhood felt different, lighter. It was as if the air itself had changed now that the HOA's grip had been broken. People who had once cowered under Linda Davenport's rule were stepping out of their homes, chatting openly about their plans to repaint their shutters, whatever color they pleased, or put up decorations without fear of a ridiculous fine. The paranoia that had settled over Oak Ridge for years was lifting. But while the HOA was gone, the damage they had done wasn't erased overnight. The first few weeks after the dissolution were chaotic. Without the HOA's so-called enforcement, a handful of former board members tried to stir up panic, warning that without their oversight, property values would plummet, lawns would become jungles, and anarchy would take hold. That nonsense didn't last long. Most residents were too thrilled about being free from nonsense fines and arbitrary rules to buy into the fear-mongering. Plus, I had made it my mission to ensure Oak Ridge didn't just survive without an HOA, it thrived. I started by organizing a community meeting, one that wasn't controlled by a power-hungry board. This was a real discussion where everyone had a say. People showed up in droves, eager to have a voice in their own neighborhood for the first time in years. The concerns were reasonable. Who would handle maintenance for shared spaces now that the HOA was gone? What about security? And most importantly, how could we prevent another HOA from forming and repeating history? I had already done my homework. I introduced the idea of a voluntary neighborhood association, one with no authority to enforce fines or dictate property aesthetics. Instead, it would serve as a resource for those who wanted to contribute to community projects. Street repairs, landscaping, security measures, all funded by donations, not mandatory fees. No power, no leverage, just people working together for the good of the neighborhood. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough to ease people's concerns. More importantly, it ensured no one like Linda could ever worm their way back into power. With that settled, I turned my attention to the last loose end, Linda and her husband, Greg. They had gone quiet since their humiliating defeat. No more letters, no more threats. Their house sat dark most nights, blinds drawn tight. I figured they were just waiting for the dust to settle before making their next move. Then one evening, Mark knocked on my door with an expression that told me something was up. Greg had been seen sneaking around the former HOA office, the building I now owned. I wasn't surprised. The place had been the heart of their little empire, and losing it had to sting. But I wasn't about to let them sabotage anything on their way out. That night I waited. Sure enough, just past midnight, headlights flickered down the street and a car rolled to a stop near the now vacant HOA headquarters. Greg climbed out, a flashlight in one hand and a crowbar in the other. I stepped out of the shadows before he could even reach the door. "You must be lost," I said, making sure my voice carried through the empty street. Greg froze, his grip tightening on the crowbar. He wasn't expecting an audience. He forced a laugh, trying to play it off. "Just checking on some old records, thought I left something behind." "Funny," I said, stepping closer. "Because I distinctly remember telling you and your wife to clear out weeks ago. You don't own this place anymore, remember?" His jaw clenched. "You've got no proof I was doing anything wrong." I pulled my phone from my pocket and turned the screen toward him. The security cameras I had installed after the purchase had picked up everything, every sneaky visit, every attempt to tamper with the locks. Greg's face drained of color. "You're trespassing," I continued, my voice calm. "And judging by that crowbar, I'd say you were planning on more than just reminiscing." He took a step back, eyes darting toward his car. "This is harassment," I laughed. "No, Greg, this is justice." His bravado wavered. "What do you want?" I tilted my head, considering. "You and Linda have two choices. Option 1, you leave town quietly, sell your house, and never interfere with this neighborhood again. Option 2, I turn this footage over to the police along with everything I have on the arson." His breathing was uneven now. He knew he didn't have a way out. "I'll talk to Linda," he muttered. "You do that," I said, "but don't take too long. My patience only lasts so long." Greg scrambled back to his car and disappeared into the night. Within a week, a for sale sign appeared in front of the Davenports' house. A few weeks after that, they were gone. With them out of the picture, Oak Ridge finally felt like home again. People started taking pride in their properties not out of fear of fines, but because they genuinely wanted to. Neighbors helped each other out instead of reporting each other for minor infractions. The paranoia that had once ruled the streets was replaced with something new, trust. And as for the old HOA headquarters, I had it torn down. In its place, we built a park. A space for the community, owned by no one, controlled by no one, just a place for people to gather, to live, to enjoy their neighborhood without fear. Standing there, watching kids play where the HOA's office had once stood, I knew we had won. Not just against Linda, not just against Greg, but against the idea that a neighborhood needed rulers. Oak Ridge didn't need an HOA. All it needed was its people. With the HOA dismantled, the Davenports gone, and the new community-run system in place, Oak Ridge had transformed. The tension that had once gripped the neighborhood dissolved, replaced by something stronger: unity. People who had barely spoken to each other before were now working together, maintaining their own homes without a bureaucratic noose around their necks. But while the HOA was dead, its ghost still lingered. A few former board members had been whispering about restoring order. They didn't have the power to fine people anymore, but that hadn't stopped them from trying to stir up trouble. They had been the HOA's enforcers, the ones who gleefully issued citations for things as petty as a slightly overgrown lawn or a garden gnome that didn't fit the aesthetic. Now, without their authority, they were desperate to claw back any control they could. The worst of them was Curtis Lane. Curtis had been Linda's right-hand man, a retired accountant with too much time on his hands and a deep love for micromanaging. He had spent years marching up and down the streets of Oak Ridge, clipboard in hand, documenting every violation he could find. He thrived on rules, regulations, and making other people miserable. And now, with the HOA gone, he was furious. I spotted him one afternoon standing in the middle of the cul-de-sac, arms crossed, watching as a group of kids rode their bikes down the street. His expression was sour, like he had just bitten into something rotten. "You know, without the HOA, this neighborhood is going to fall apart," he said, loud enough for me to hear as I walked past. I stopped, turning to face him. "Looks fine to me," Curtis scoffed, "for now. But give it a few months. People will stop mowing their lawns, cars will be parked on the streets like junkyards, and before you know it, property values will tank. People take care of their homes because they want to," I said, "not because you threaten them with fines." He narrowed his eyes. "You think you've won, but you don't understand what you've done. The HOA kept this place in order." I met his glare with a level stare. "No, Curtis, the HOA kept people afraid. Big difference." He didn't have a response to that, just a tight-lipped frown before he turned and walked off. I knew that wouldn't be the last I'd hear from him. A week later, the first anonymous complaint appeared. It was a typed letter, stuffed into my mailbox with no return address. It claimed that certain individuals in the neighborhood were failing to meet community standards, and that concerned residents were prepared to take action if things didn't improve. I crumpled the letter and tossed it in the trash. The next day, I found another one, this time taped to my front door. Same nonsense, same veiled threats. Mark, my neighbor, caught me as I was tossing that one in the bin, shaking his head. "Curtis is behind this. He's been going door to door, trying to get people to sign some kind of petition to bring back the HOA." I raised an eyebrow. "And," Mark grinned, "nobody's biting. People actually laughed in his face." That was good news, but it didn't stop Curtis from trying. He started spreading rumors, claims that without an HOA to keep things in check, crime would rise, homes would start depreciating, and Oak Ridge would become a free-for-all. It was nonsense, of course, but I wasn't about to let him stir up fear without a response, so I called a meeting. Not a formal one, just an open invitation for anyone in the neighborhood who wanted to talk about the future of Oak Ridge. We met in the park where the old HOA office had once stood, the place that had symbolized control and fines now replaced with benches, trees, and a playground. People showed up in droves. Families, retirees, younger homeowners, all of them eager to shut down Curtis's nonsense before it gained traction. Curtis himself arrived halfway through, standing near the back, arms folded, glaring. I addressed the crowd. "We've seen what happens when a small group of people get too much power over a neighborhood. We all lived under it for years. And now, without them, this place hasn't fallen apart. In fact, it's better than ever." A few people nodded, murmuring agreement. I continued. "But there are some who want to bring that system back, and if we let them, we'll be right back where we started." Someone from the crowd shouted, "No chance." Curtis finally spoke up. "You act like the HOA was some kind of dictatorship. It was about maintaining standards." A woman near the front, Mrs. Holloway, who had lived in Oak Ridge longer than anyone, turned to face him. "You fined me $500 because my front door was the wrong shade of blue." Curtis's face darkened. "It was about uniformity." Mrs. Holloway crossed her arms. "It was about control." The crowd erupted into murmurs, nods of agreement spreading. I locked eyes with Curtis. "You tried to scare people into thinking they needed you, but the truth is they never did." For the first time, Curtis looked uneasy. He glanced around, realizing that no one was on his side. I stepped closer. "This neighborhood isn't yours to control anymore. It belongs to the people who live here, and they've made their choice." The silence that followed was louder than any argument. Curtis's jaw tightened. Without another word, he turned and left. That was the last we saw of him. Within a month, his house had a "for sale" sign in front of it. With Curtis gone, things finally settled. The neighborhood thrived not because of an overbearing HOA, but because people actually cared. Gardens flourished, homes were well kept, and the sense of community was stronger than ever. The final nail in the coffin of the old system came when a group of residents gathered to officially amend the neighborhood's founding documents, ensuring that no HOA could ever be reinstated without the unanimous consent of every homeowner. It was over. One evening, as I sat on my porch watching the sunset, Mark walked over, hands in his pockets. "You did it," he said. I shook my head. "We did it," he chuckled. "I still can't believe how far Linda and her crew went, burning your shed down, insane." I glanced at my backyard, where a brand new shed now stood sturdier, fireproof, and built entirely by volunteers from the neighborhood who had wanted to help. "Yeah," I said, "but in the end they lost everything, and we got something better." Mark nodded, then grinned. "So what's next?" "Gonna buy the whole town," I laughed. "Nah, I think I'll just enjoy living in a place where people actually look out for each other." And for the first time in years, Oak Ridge truly felt like home. The transformation of Oak Ridge had been nothing short of remarkable. With the HOA permanently disbanded, and the last of its enforcers gone, the neighborhood had settled into a new rhythm, one that wasn't dictated by arbitrary rules or power-hungry board members. But there was still work to be done. Without the HOA siphoning money from homeowners, people had started putting their resources into real improvements. A group of residents had come together to repair the cracked sidewalks that the HOA had always ignored, despite collecting fees for neighborhood upkeep. Others were working on revamping the old community garden, which had been neglected for years under Linda Davenport's reign. One evening, I was helping Mark and a few others install new solar-powered lamps along the main road when a car rolled to a stop nearby. The driver's side door opened, and a man stepped out, tall, sharp-featured, and dressed in a suit that seemed out of place in a neighborhood where people were finally embracing their freedom. I recognized him immediately. His name was Richard Calloway, a real estate developer who had been circling Oak Ridge like a vulture ever since the HOA fell apart. I had seen his name pop up in various land records and property transactions over the past few months, and I knew exactly what he wanted. He walked up with a practiced smile, the kind that was meant to put people at ease. "Evening, gentlemen," he said, his voice smooth. "I've been meaning to introduce myself. Richard Calloway. I've been looking into investment opportunities in the area and wanted to discuss a few possibilities with you." Mark leaned on his shovel, unimpressed. "What kind of opportunities?" Richard clasped his hands together. "Oak Ridge is in a unique position. Without an HOA, property values are vulnerable. But with the right oversight, this neighborhood could become one of the most desirable in the region. I represent a group of investors who would be interested in reinstating structured governance, something that ensures long-term stability." I wiped the sweat from my forehead with the back of my hand and crossed my arms. "You mean bringing back an HOA?" Richard chuckled as if the idea amused him. "Not in the way you're thinking. This would be different, more refined. An association with clear benefits, structured to maintain order without the overreach of the past." Mark let out a sharp laugh. "That's exactly what Linda said when she ran things into the ground." Richard didn't falter. "I understand the hesitation, truly. But I think you'll find that having responsible leadership can prevent future issues. There's a reason most successful neighborhoods have oversight." I took a step closer. "There's also a reason why Oak Ridge got rid of it." His smile never wavered, but there was something calculating behind his eyes. "I'd like to set up a meeting with some of the homeowners, just an informal discussion about ways we can enhance the community. No obligations, of course." Mark scoffed. "Yeah, no thanks." Richard turned his attention back to me, clearly realizing I was the one he needed to convince. "Think about it. Without a governing body, what's stopping outside buyers from turning this into a rental-heavy neighborhood? Investors will move in, properties will get divided, and before you know it, Oak Ridge won't be the place you love anymore." I met his gaze, unflinching. "You mean investors like you?" The slightest flicker of irritation crossed his face before he buried it under that polished exterior. "I'm here to help, not exploit. I let the silence stretch between us before finally speaking. There's no meeting, no discussion, Oak Ridge is fine the way it is. Richard studied me for a long moment, then nodded as if he had expected that answer. Fair enough, but I'll be around. If anyone changes their mind, they know where to find me. Without another word, he turned and walked back to his car, driving off into the night. Mark shook his head. That guy's not going away, I exhaled, already knowing he was right. No, he's not, but we'll be ready for him. Over the next few weeks, Richard Calloway made his presence known. He started small, sending out flyers promising community enhancements and strategic neighborhood planning. When that didn't get much traction, he upped his game, hosting free events in the park, complete with catered food and live music. He made sure to mingle, planting the idea that Oak Ridge needed direction if it wanted to stay desirable. Some people listened. Not many, but enough that I knew he wasn't just going to disappear. Lisa, my attorney friend, had been keeping an eye on his movements. One afternoon, she called me with an update. He's buying up properties, she said, quietly, through different LLCs. That got my attention. How many? 5 so far, all cash offers. He's targeting older homeowners who might be looking to sell quickly. I clenched my jaw. He's trying to gain leverage. Exactly, Lisa confirmed. If he gets enough properties under his control, he'll start pushing for changes, reintroducing bylaws, restricting what people can do with their homes. He's playing the long game. I wasn't about to let that happen. I called another community meeting, laying out everything we knew about Richard's tactics. People were angry, not just because he was trying to bring back the very thing we had fought to get rid of, but because he was doing it underhandedly. We made a plan. A group of residents started spreading the word, warning potential sellers to be wary of unsolicited offers. Lisa helped draft a legal document that allowed homeowners to band together, creating a protective agreement that prevented a single entity from buying up too many properties in a short period. Then, I went one step further. Using the same strategy Richard had been employing, I reached out to my own network friends, local business owners, and community-minded investors. We pooled resources and started buying up properties ourselves, ensuring they stayed in the hands of people who actually cared about Oak Ridge. It didn't take long for Richard to realize his plan was crumbling. One evening, he showed up at my doorstep, his usual polished demeanor cracking just slightly around the edges. "I have to admit," he said, "I didn't expect this much resistance." I leaned against the doorframe. "You thought you could outmaneuver us. That was your mistake," he sighed, rubbing his temple. "You could be making a huge financial mistake here. The right kind of development could turn this neighborhood into something incredible." I held his gaze. "It already is." For the first time, Richard looked frustrated. "You're holding this place back." I shook my head. "No, I'm protecting it." He exhaled sharply, then shook his head. "Fine, have it your way, but this isn't over." As he walked away, I knew he was wrong. It was over. Because Oak Ridge wasn't just a neighborhood anymore, it was a community. And no amount of money or manipulation was going to change that. With Richard Calloway's plan dismantled, and the last remnants of the HOA's influence wiped away, life in Oak Ridge finally settled into a new normal. The neighborhood was thriving without the iron grip of micromanagers dictating every detail. Homes were well kept not because of threats, but because people took pride in their community. Gardens flourished with whatever plants people wanted, driveways held the cars their owners actually used, and for the first time in years, Oak Ridge felt like a place where people could breathe. But I knew better than to believe it would stay peaceful forever. Richard had backed off publicly, but I wasn't naive enough to think he had given up. He wasn't the type to walk away from an investment without exhausting every possible angle. He had tried legal loopholes, backdoor deals, and even community manipulation, but none of it had worked. Whatever he had planned next, I had to be ready. And then the letters started again. Unlike before, these weren't from an HOA board or an anonymous complaint. They were official, stamped with the logo of a newly formed Oak Ridge Community Betterment Initiative. The wording was careful, deliberately ambiguous, but the intent was clear. It was a new attempt at control, packaged differently. The letter claimed that Oak Ridge was at risk of declining property values and suggested that homeowners voluntarily contribute to a new neighborhood oversight fund. The funds, it claimed, would go toward beautification efforts and community standards enforcement. It wasn't mandatory yet. But I knew where this was going. I brought the letter to Lisa, who studied it with narrowed eyes. "This is a setup," she said. "They're trying to re-establish an HOA without calling it one. If enough people volunteer into this, they'll use it as justification to start dictating rules again." I nodded. "And once they have a foothold, they'll start pushing for actual regulations." Lisa leaned back, tapping her fingers against the desk. "We could shut this down fast. Legally, they have no authority unless homeowners agree to it. If we get ahead of this, we can make sure no one signs on." I had already been thinking the same thing. The neighborhood had fought too hard to free itself from the old system to let a rebranded version creep back in. The next day, Mark and I went door to door, warning people about what was happening. Most were immediately on board with shutting it down, but a few were hesitant. Richard's initiative had been careful with its wording, making it seem like a harmless way to protect the neighborhood. One homeowner, an older man named Dennis, frowned as he held up the letter. "I don't want another HOA, but what if this really is just about keeping things nice?" Mark crossed his arms. "That's how they always start. First, it's voluntary, then they start attaching conditions. Before you know it, they're telling you what color your house has to be." Dennis exhaled, shaking his head. "I just don't want the neighborhood to go downhill." I gestured around. "Look at it now. People are taking care of their homes because they want to, not because they're afraid of fines. Do you really think we need another group of outsiders telling us what to do?" Dennis studied the letter for a long moment before nodding. "You're right. I'll spread the word." One by one, we got to every homeowner, making sure they understood exactly what was happening. Lisa helped draft a simple petition rejecting the so-called Betterment Initiative. Within days, nearly every homeowner had signed. The next time Richard tried pushing his plan, he found himself facing an entire neighborhood that had already made its decision. At the next public meeting, held in the park where the HOA office had once stood, he tried one last time to sell his vision. Dressed in the same crisp suit, he stood before the gathered residents, his voice smooth and professional as he laid out his case. "This isn't about control," he said. "It's about securing the future of Oak Ridge. Without structure, neighborhoods decline. I've seen it happen time and time again." I stepped forward before he could continue. "We've seen what happens when people like you get control. This neighborhood isn't declining. It's thriving without your interference." Murmurs of agreement spread through the crowd. Richard's jaw tightened, but he kept his expression neutral. "I understand the concerns," he said, "but without an organized effort, what's stopping property values from tanking?" "What's stopping outside investors from?" Lisa cut in. "You mean investors like you?" A few people chuckled. Richard's composure slipped for the first time. "This initiative was meant to be a collaboration," he said, his tone sharper now. "A way for residents to have a say in their own future." I folded my arms. "We already have that, and we don't need you to dictate it." Richard scanned the crowd, realizing he had lost before he even started. No one was buying what he was selling. After a long pause, he exhaled and nodded stiffly. "Very well. If the community doesn't want my help, I won't force it." He left soon after, and within a month, his company started selling off the properties they had purchased. The moment he realized he had no foothold, he cut his losses and moved on to easier targets. With him gone, Oak Ridge was finally, truly free. The neighborhood continued to flourish, not because of regulations, but because people actually cared. The park was expanded, local businesses thrived, and instead of fearing fines, people worked together to keep things running smoothly. One evening, as I sat on my porch watching the sunset, Mark walked over, hands tucked into his pockets. "You ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't fought back?" he asked. I thought about the burned-down shed, the HOA's threats, the way they had tried to strangle the neighborhood into submission. Then I looked around at what Oak Ridge had become. "No," I said. "Because we never let it happen," Mark grinned. "Damn right. For the first time in years, Oak Ridge was more than just a collection of houses. It was a real community. And this time, no one was going to take that away."